Afrocentric mean? I'll talk briefly about three themes related to this, what I see in the literature across Africa, the experiences, issue of coverage, and then inclusion and delivery, and I'll make my conclusions. When it comes to coverage, it's very limited, as already highlighted. Countries are investing very little into this. And I think among the countries I've highlighted as the countries I covered, I must quote Egypt has better support, or rather coverage, and even the percentage of GDP, plus South Africa, a bit of Cape Verde as well in the ones I covered. Tanzania follows. Kenya has very minimal, but doing a lot. So hopefully Kenya will get there. Social assistance, as you know, is the non-contributory. And this is the point that we will have to keep looking at. Non-contributory. Then where do we get the money if it's non-contributory? These are critical questions. And yet Africa is dominated by cash transfers. And you heard our cabinet secretary say that we are moving away from, we are giving people cash because it gives them many powers. You know, they can make decisions, they can decide where to invest in, as opposed to giving them food aid and all that. So the social insurance, which is based on employment, very few are in that. And as you know, every other day, Africa is losing those who are formally employed. And this is even worse with COVID. So we are basically saying, if we want to build a viable social protection, look into the other side, the informal economy, which is currently taking the majority of people who are fallen off. But the question is how to design that kind of program. The labor market programs, which should complement the two, are very minimal across the continent. They are not many, they are very minimal. Let me now talk about inclusion, still focusing on the concept of non-contributory. Because Africa and many social protection programs, not just only in Africa, even in the Western world, uses this as the intervention to fill the gap. But in the context where you want to support children, elderly, chronic poor, and all those disadvantaged groups, and you don't have enough resources, it becomes a huge problem. I give an example of South Africa, for example. South Africa is doing very well in general, and almost satisfying 84% of social protection on this group of social assistance. And the poverty index in South Africa is about 26% or so. So you can see that maybe with COVID, it has maybe even increased that 26%. So when we will be talking about looking for options in particular in the fiscal area, whether governments can generate money, these are the things we have to look for. Because governments don't have anywhere else to generate money. Government generates money from resources from human beings and from our work, you know. So if there is no work, the economy is not doing well, you can't improve all these delivery mechanisms that you're looking at. And of course, in this delivery across Africa is both conditional and unconditional, what they're doing. And the elaborate contributions, like if you look at Egypt and South Africa, they have very elaborate contributory, non-contributory social assistance. For example, South Africa has this, which is very good for Africa, supporting those who are out of school and apprentices that have just qualified. You find that some countries are having all this, labor-based training. But after they train the young people, nobody knows where these young people go. There is nowhere to absorb them. So you can't handle one arm of intervention without handling the other one. So if we are growing the economies, we must also grow the economy so that those that we train on the labor basis can be able to enter the labor market. And that might help. In Egypt, you have very elaborate, social assistance, including, subsidizing bread, which Egypt has done for so long. And whenever Egypt tries to pull it out, people riot and they can't pull it out. And this is a critical question. I think I asked in the chat, and maybe somebody from the ministry later will help us. When we have a registry like we have in Kenya, how does one update that registry, and is there an exit from the registry? At what point do you exit? And I think this is now the bottom point that I have there. issues of pre-qualification. For example, Egypt has a means and affluence testing. That's a very complex exercise, means and affluence testing. How long can you do it? And do we have the capacity across Africa to be doing means and affluence testing? Of course, it's very much related to how do you identify those that need support, and not only those that need support, those that should be out of support. I may be looped into social assistance, but in another 2-3 months, 6, I'm off. I don't need it anymore. Are we able as Africa to have capacity to do that? That in itself would help us a lot in bridging the gap, but is not often doable. Informality, which is a big issue of discussion, is quite a problem. I know that ILO has a goal of moving people from informal to formal. But I must say that is not an end in itself. It's a process, because there will always be people working informally. I started hearing this debate when I was a young person doing my master's or undergraduate, and I still hear of people planning to move people from formal to informal. But I think what it means is that there will be graduation. I think that the concept is graduation, but the other discourse is that the non-graduating are very many, and if you cannot deal with the out of school, for example, and get them on, then they will just be blotting what you have exited from the informal. So there is really the formal schemes which have now opened up for informality. We have formal contributory schemes opened for the informal sector, but this opening is not being picked up by the informal sector. And it's largely because of so many variables that I will not go into now, but it includes them claiming that it's costly. It also includes the bureaucratic processes involved and the delivery. It's about delivery. But I must say that the cost should not be overemphasized for the informal workers. The resources that informal workers spend in their own groups and entities is much, much higher, for example, than the 500 shillings that, for example, Kenya needs them to pay to access social insurance, which they can. In my analysis, they can. But also, we have to understand that people in informality spread their risk. A concept maybe that the government does not capture right. They spread their risk across. So you find that one person can be in 5-6 groups. In total, they can be, getting savings all over that overamount to what is expected. So I think these are things that we will discuss going forward. And there are many programs, as highlighted in the PowerPoint, that are trying to address that. Tanzania has tried an option where they are giving incentives for the informal sector to join the formal schemes, but there is always a hitch as you go along. In terms of delivery, there are challenges. The challenges really are about multiple actors, approaches, and coordination, which result in inefficiencies. But what is unique is that many countries or Africa, there is this false thinking that technology solves everything. I don't think technology will solve everything. Technology is good. It can improve coordination and governance, but for example, in the provision of social protection, if we are not able to coordinate the actors fast so that the actors can bring on board the data that goes into the system of this digital technology, I don't think we will be going far. I mean, at least when it does like consolidation of cash transfer programs, that's good enough. But even when you consolidate that program, you have to ensure that that consolidation is up to date and data is coming in and out, and this is a regular thing going on. We had an electronic single register in Kenya, a great one, but I'm also asking, how do you update it? Do people exit it? How is it managed? I think that's going to be the big deal. Whether you are cash transfer at least is clear, because if you already have a good database, you only know that you have to do cash transfer electronic. Good enough. South Africa is even venturing into biometric. So to conclude, I conclude, and I did this same conclusion when we had the regional workshops that Daniel, my colleague, talked about. I see the future of social protection as bleak. And it's bleak just because of the weak economic growth, the informality we have, the vulnerable groups, the dominance of social assistance. I am hoping that Africa going forward, this social assistance, we can start seeing almost same level, social assistance, social insurance, and also labor market, so that these three can complement each other for us to move to the next scale. Of course, the viability of universal healthcare, which I've also seen is coming out in the countries that we reviewed, and old age pension, again, is doubtful. If we cannot generate resources and more people are getting into informality and ending up without putting anything into the pot for social protection, this universal healthcare and paying old age pension might not be really very viable. So I think still we are back to the strategy of expanding economies and opportunities for productive employment. Then the question of viability, which is very critical. I think we must just continue. I'm not being that pessimistic. I'm optimistic that we must continue improving social protection provision and building reserves for social protection, including reserves for crisis and pandemic, like what we are going through. And indeed, the strategy is to leverage on development partners and local resources to build a viable, indigenous, sustainable social protection schemes. Nobody can argue today that you don't need development partners. No, we all need development partners, but it is how you use the resources you get from your development partner to leverage for what you want as a goal that is critical. So in conclusion, really, we need to learn from the bottom-up informal insurance models cushioning majority of African citizens. Because when you see those statistics and figures, it is very clear, even the cabinet secretary, I refer to him again, he talked about only covering about 20%. I mean, it's a drop in the ocean. So the question is, what are the 80%? How are the 80% surviving that are not in the loop? I think we have a lot to do, and this is the right platform. PASGR and its Utafiti Sera are good platforms for engaging in these debates, which are not about to end. Thank you.
Everybody would agree. All right, we're okay now? Sorry about that. Everyone would agree why she gets authoritatively speak on national news on the issues affecting, us. And you see, she's being very bold when she speaks about, she sees the future of social protection is bleak, given some of the factors. And so these are some of the things that we will keep looking at and keep having discussions about. So like I said, in the event that you've got any questions, just note them down, then we'll see how we can have them responded to. And also I'll just remind the speakers, the presenters to also just take note that in the event that a question is thrown your way, you will be in a position to address it comprehensively. Now we go to our third presentation, which is the last one for this session. And it is in no way the least. It is that these presentations are sort of a build-up. And our next presenter is Professor Eric Nyambetha. Now, before he comes to the podium, and I would request the handheld microphone, let me just introduce him by way of reading his bio. Eric is a professor of anthropology at Maseno University, where he has been teaching and researching for over 18 years. Mr. Nyambetha received his BA and MA in anthropology from the University of Nairobi. Thank you. From the University of Nairobi, that is in Kenya, and conducted his PhD research at the Department of Anthropology, University of Copenhagen in Denmark. Professor Nyambetha has supported the conference organizers of that's PASGR in understanding social protection for over 10 years now, contributing to the writing of various book chapters. Of note, in 2011, the chapter on, quote, child vulnerability and the community coping mechanisms, implications for social protection policy in Africa, end of quote, in the social protection for Africa's children Routledge book. So at this point, without much further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Eric Nyambetha to come and share his presentation, which is on conceptualization of social protection in Africa. Karibu sana, Prof. Is it on? No press.
Well, thank you very much. Let me take this opportunity to thank all of you for availing yourselves here, sacrificing your time. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the previous speakers, starting from our Honorable CS and the ministry, government representatives, and also other colleagues who have already presented. My presentation, going straight away, is about the roadmap to social protection. What are the roots of social protection, and where did we start, and where are we today, and what are the future of social protection programs in Africa? Already the previous speaker has said very authoritatively that the future is not really very bright, and there are reasons that if you properly unpack that idea. Now, in terms of conceptualization, social protection in Africa is, thank you very much. Social protection in Africa is a concept that actually has got different meanings and interpretations of what it actually means. And this depends on how individual African countries actually perceive, analyze their own social problems and respond to those social problems. And of course, when you look critically at the literature, you don't really find major differences in terms of conceptualization of social protection. To a great extent, it talks about mitigating the economic shocks that vulnerable populations of various African countries citizens face. And it's more or less talking about social provisioning. But now, how they conceptualize and even analyze those vulnerabilities that lead to programming for social protection, and of course, the root causes is what really makes difference from one African country to another. And of course, this is also very much embedded in the political establishments of those particular countries. And therefore, the differences that we see already, Professor Mitula has talked about Egypt, South Africa, and all these other countries. She's talked about Tanzania and these other countries. Those differences that we see in the way the social protection programs are designed in those different countries are actually, to a great extent, of course, influenced by the conceptualizations, but there is also that aspect of power differences and interests. That's what we call ideological differences. That there are different players, both locally and internationally, including the donors, who have got different ideological ways of understanding and conceptualizing what social protection is. And of course, they push those interests through African countries. For instance, if you look at what the DFID is doing, they are much more about safety nets and of course cash transfer programs. The World Bank is talking about social risk management, and these approaches actually influence what you see happening in Africa today. And the CS for education, for labor and social protection alluded to this when, from his presentation, you could already see that much of our social protection programs are on cash transfers and are donor-led. That is something that we take a lot of interest in. And of course, the next slide, please. In terms of how we got there, and this has already also been mentioned, social protection is not new in Africa. Social protection is something that existed pre-colonial times. And this is based on our own African egalitarian modes of livelihoods the African value systems and the neighborhood that pre-existed even the colonial times. And as this presentation progresses further, you will see that those elements that existed in what a good number of us are now calling informal social protection mechanisms are the ideas that pre-existed, and they have lived up to the present times. And so what do we do with them? We shall get back to that. And of course, so that is the first phase, if we are talking about social protection. The second phase, we are talking about the nationalist phase. That is during the times when African countries became independent. A number of African countries became independent, and to a great extent, the struggle for independence was for African values and all these kind of things. And so they came up with a more or less welfarist approach to development, which was more in terms of harnessing social cohesion, inclusivity, and of course, based on African values. And of course, these are you already know about the ideas of Kwame Nkrumah and the ideas of Mwalimu Julius Nyerere. And most of African countries now came up with these so-called African socialism and sessional papers that now were aimed at changing what the colonial regimes had done and Africanizing the economies. And through this, the idea of welfarist approach to development was embraced. And of course, that happened for some time. And in the next phase of what we want to call issues, ideological issues that have led us to where we are today, we are talking about the Washington Consensus and structural adjustment programs, which a good number of us have witnessed the liberalization of the economies, removing away social welfare spending from the government and putting it under the market-driven framework. That is what actually contributed to, and in the analysis, you will find that this actually did not help Africa much. And a good number of millions and millions of Africans got deeper into poverty and of course, desperation because of the structural adjustment programs. And on realization of this World Bank prescribed economic models for Africa, we call them the neoliberalist economic models. Again, the international community came up with new measures. One of them, of course, you have already been told about poverty reduction strategy papers that, of course, even here in Kenya, we had that. Then we had, of course, the social adjustment programs as a way of mitigating the negative effects of Washington Consensus and the so-called market-driven framework as a way of development. And of course, after this, in the process of doing that, we have also heard about MDGs, Millennium Development Goals. These Millennium Development Goals, which of course came up with a number of goals and what needed to be done to improve the welfare of people, did not actually contribute much because to a great extent, they also remained more or less top-down approach and were more or less also modeled along the frameworks of the neoliberalists and the market-driven frameworks. They didn't help much, and of course, now the third phase or the fourth phase of this journey to social protection is domiciled in the post-Washington Consensus, which is more or less a mixture of the nationalist approach. You are now hearing about cash transfers and things like that. And of course, as you can see, you'll see from this presentation, there is the aspect of transformative social protection. Now that debate is coming in. And of course, the neoliberalist ideologies are still reigning. So currently, we are in that mix in terms of social protection. And you would already see what even the CS was talking about here and what other countries around Africa are doing. Now, the next slide, please. So I would like to go back to the issue of social protection, because I think it is very important for me and for this conference, because of our theme on Afrocentric social protection design. And we are talking about, just to understand what this informal social protection is all about, it's about social networks that are based on collective norms. And when Professor Winnie talks about the informal sector workers and what they do, in Kenya here we have the chamas wherever they are, and how we can bring those into the mainstream social protection, what we call the formal social protection. That's an issue. So, but basically this is what happens. And of course, as you already know, and you have already been told, that most of people in Africa, here in Kenya about 80%, in other countries it would be more than 80%, depend on informal sector. So our formal social protection programs, like the pensions that we already have, the health insurance, and all these other aspects of social protection do not reach over 80% of the African population because they belong to the informal economic sector. And that is a big question that we want to deal with, that we really need to deal with. And when we hear Professor Winnie talking about the future of social protection in its real sense being bleak, is that already 80% of the African population and the poor are outside the formal social protection. And so if we are talking about inclusivity, we are talking about justice, then that is the work we have ahead of us in terms of moving forward social protection. And of course, the cabinet secretary said that the cash transfers that we already have only covers 12% of the vulnerable populations, meaning that over 88% of vulnerable populations are not included. And you can see I've given just some few examples of what this social protection, how this social protection is domiciled or is manifested in the lives of some Africans in different countries. Like among the Islamic communities, for historically, they have had this zakat, mainly in Northern African countries. In places like Uganda, of course, we know about the concept of Muno Mukabi. These are indigenous African concepts that spell out the informal social protection, the way it is manifested in the lives of ordinary persons who are not employed or who are employed, but still there is that cross-cutting or the influence of the African social values in the lives of these people. And of course, my idea is that these indigenous concepts through which social protections in Africa is currently manifested can be harnessed when we now start talking about the wider vision for social protection in Africa. Next slide, please. And of course, in terms of policy and legislative framework, I just want to brush through this. The idea of social protection, leaving out what I've already talked about in the pre-colonial times, was triggered by the debate and the declarations within the AU. And of course, these have actually institutionalized social protection. One of these was the Banjul Charter on Human Rights and on Human and People's Rights of 1981. This Banjul Charter talked about the right to food, the right to health, the right to basic needs. Although the charter did not talk about social protection at that time, but if you look at the provisions of that charter, then it's basically grappling with the problems that we are facing today in terms of institutionalizing social protection within the African context. And of course, more now later in 2008, the African Social Policy Framework, or the AU Social Policy Framework for Africa, this now defined social protection. And therefore, for the first time, we have an African definition of social protection within this AU Social Policy Framework. That is just more recently in 2008. And of course, we now have the AU Agenda 2060 2063, which talks about the Africa we want. And this is much more also subsumed in what the SDGs talk about when they talk about leaving no one behind. And this Agenda 20, AU Agenda 2063 actually sets this minimum threshold for social provisioning in Africa and actually defines social protection as a right to the citizens' right. So when you hear scholars talking about the future not being very bleak, it means that when now we talk about social protection as a right, we have a very huge task ahead of us as African nations to institutionalize it, and it means a lot of other things. So I'm saying that these declarations actually took into consideration indigenous informal social protection systems, and of course they have supported the domestication of social protection within the AU member states. Next slide. Just attempt, this is not conclusive or it's not exhaustive, but just an attempt of what other countries are doing and the journey, how far they have gone with this journey. You can see that countries like South Africa, Tunisia, Cape Verde, Zambia, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe, they now frame social protection as a right. And you know that has got implications on government spending and their policies, which is something that I'm sure we shall revisit later on. Government spending, when you talk about social protection as a right of every citizen. And of course, they are trying to adopt the more welfareist approach to development that is currently being reigning in the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, where social provisioning is a right, and actually it is fulfilled. And then, of course, countries like Liberia, Ethiopia, Uganda, Kenya, these ones, if you look at the policy documents and the legal framework, they acknowledge both formal and informal social protection within their documentation. This is now a move towards the transformative social protection that we are talking about, and which in the next few slides you'll be able to see. And Madagascar, of course, and Central African Republic, they are more or less talking about specified certain sections. This is what we call targeted social protection. So these countries are still at the level of targeted social protection, and not very much efforts are being made towards universalization. And of course, Gambia is talking about universal social protection, which, of course, in other countries, for instance, here in Kenya, we have started it in piecemeal in terms of talking about universal health coverage, but we are still not meeting it because of various reasons that Kenyan government and also the population knows or are yet to understand. Now, in terms of, next slide, in terms of a wider vision for social protection, we are, and of course now, we are moving to the theme of this conference, which talk about Afrocentric design for social protection. How are we building on this history of our progression from those pre-colonial times, from all those nationalist eras, Washington and post-Washington era, and where we are today, to come up with a more inclusive social protection program that addresses the reality of the African people, and of course, justice and dignity. So that's when you talk about transformative social protection framework, in my view, and based on the literature that is available, this is one most important point in terms of moving social protection forward. And it's one important point in terms of Afrocentricizing social protection. And of course, this debate is currently gaining a lot of momentum, and it's because of the skepticism associated with targeted social provisioning, and the need for social protection programs that address the reality of the African people. Let's move to the next. So, transformative social protection, according to what I see in the existing literature and the trends, even from the research and other meetings that we've had about social protection, will support actually meeting the challenge of inclusive development by departing from the current social protection programs and return to the wider vision for African people. The current social protection programs, to a great extent, is something which is close to what Professor Winnie was talking about in terms of social assistance, which to a great extent is limited to addressing only economic shocks. And this does not take into consideration the fact that vulnerability for African people cannot only be addressed by cushioning them from economic shocks. There are social and also political issues around it that make people vulnerable. So what that means is that when we are moving towards a transformative social protection mechanism, then we need a holistic definition of what makes an African person vulnerable. And if you got deeper into the researches that some of us have done on even the cash transfer programs, they are, to a great extent, a source of insecurity in some places, a source of destabilization in some families, and all this, and also, of course, a source of discontent within the communities. So then, how do we move on and come up with our social protection program that is more inclusive, that will enhance social cohesion and harmonious living relationships within communities, within households? That's the question that we still have to deal with at the moment, even as we talk about moving social protection program forward. And of course, we are saying that the transformative social protection programs should be embedded within the legal recognitions of rights, within the constitutions, within the policies, within the national strategies. And we then talking about a rights-based approach to social protection, not merely social assistance. Now, as we continue to vision a transformative social protection, as we continue to talk about social protection being a right and therefore being a contract between the citizens and the government, we should also think about recent issues, recent economic challenges that we have faced as a continent. One of them, of course, being the issue of COVID-19, which has led to, not only in Africa, but around the globe, what we call economic recession. And of course, this has contributed to economic distress in the developing countries. And of course, we are saying that if this is the case, then more people are likely to become vulnerable, and therefore our spending on social protection is supposed to go up. And it's going up against a backdrop where more and more citizens are being sensitized, and we are talking about social protection being a right. Therefore, citizens are going to demand for it. So what that really means is that the African states will need to redesign social policy to enhance the issues of production. How are we going to increase production? How are we going to reform our tax regimes so that we have more money to sustain social protection programs, and more so when we are talking about transformative social protection? How are we going to use the resources that we have to make a larger population, segment of populations in Africa to be economically productive, to give back to the taxed base that can then support the overall social protection and justice. So we are talking about issues of productivity. But more importantly, also something that is not really gaining a lot of prominence is redistribution of these resources. We need to think carefully. For instance, countries like Kenya, where you have the national government and county governments funded by the same taxpayer, and the different layers of the same government are coming up with social protection programs. Why can't we perhaps think in a better way of dealing with that so that we can realize the fruits of our efforts in social protection? I think that is the end of my contribution. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Prof, for that. Let's appreciate him one more time. So much to learn. And from all these professors, you feel like you leave this place with a diploma. In just one day, you get a diploma. So many profs, doctors, and we're not even in a hospital. So thank you very much for that. So at this point, just some pointers on slight changes to the program just by virtue of the delays that we've experienced. This. Yes. As we had to accommodate our chief guest and the other matters. We're meant to be having our breakout sessions. What we'll do is that we will suspend that to tomorrow. So at this point, I'm going to call once again. I'm going to call Edwin to come and take us through an interactive session. We had the Q&A and the likes, both online and from the floor. Then after that, we shall have one more presentation, and then we can break out for lunch. And tomorrow we will combine the breakout so that it will be including the regional perspective as well. So just bear with us. We're going on well, I believe, all factors considered. And so even as you ask your questions, we request that you make your questions concise so that we can accommodate as much as possible. And if you hear that the question that you had has already been asked, you don't have to ask it, just so that we can accommodate as much diversity in our content as possible. So, Edwin.
Ladies and gentlemen, once again, I have the great honor of moderating our interactive session number 2. So same link, same procedure. So for the audience here, go back to menti.com and use the code that we used earlier on. For those that are online, I've posted the link. You can join once again. Nice to see people liking and giving thumbs up and liking this. So for those that are online, are you able to log in? Are you able to follow the link? All right. So we have one reflection question that I would like us to interact with, or rather respond to. So as we did with the other questions, please respond to this. State your name and where you're coming from. So, yeah. For those that are online, I've posted the link on the chats. For those that are here, using the same code. And you can see the code right at the top of the slide. All right. Somebody has stated a lead capture. If you can as well, please include your name to your next to your post. Okay, that works. Key issues for Africa in social protection. There's a lead capture. The question of donors. We have indigenous. I'm assuming here is indigenous solutions and responses. Lead capture, sustainability. The question of sustainability. I suppose that's linked to donors and also leveraging local resources. There is multi-sectoral funding, which is linked. I see, wow, great, keep them coming. Social protection needs to be compassionate. About registry, I suppose this has to do with how data is collected on who are beneficiaries of social protection and how it's updated. Weak economies, I guess this is in reference to just the concluded presentation about the current realities as far as global economy is concerned. What else am I seeing here? Dignity, definitely. Social protection needs to be to dignify beneficiaries. What else can I pick out? The question of poverty eradication, equity and inequality. Social protection is to be multifaceted. Great. We're building quite a beautiful and well-populated word cloud here. Social protection needs to target individuals who are experiencing high vulnerability. Also target be implemented in the context of increased unemployment. Great, keep them coming. What else can I highlight? Social protection often ignores the majority. This is something that needs to be addressed better. Questions of delivery challenges. The question about bridging the informal and formal sector. Maybe I can highlight 3 more, then perhaps we could proceed to the next item on the program. Question of what? Pensions. I see pensions. I see coordination issues. I see empathy and needs to be questions about it being right-based, being provided as a right in policy making. Perhaps at this point, I can encourage you to keep on sharing your thoughts here. We're about to go to a session of Q&A, I believe, and our MC Dan is going to lead us through that. But you can keep on posting right before we get started on Q&A. So for the Q&A, our online audience, you can post on the chats, Zoom chats. While those who are here in person, you can just speak to the microphone and you can have somebody respond either here or on Zoom. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much as well. Put it on some chats, then you'll alert me. All right, thank you very much for that, Edwin. So in the event that there's anybody who has a question that you'd like to throw to any of the presenters, this is your opportunity. We'll just take a few in the interest of time, but we do not want to rule it out altogether because we know it's the indispensable value of getting clarifications and explanations. So anybody who is here physically who has a question, just raise your hand and I'll supply the microphone to you. All right. And then those who are our online audience or participants, I beg your pardon, just put your questions in the chats. We shall be alerted of the same. Then you can ask those who are here to, those who the authorities to respond to it. So I'll just take the microphone to the lady here. I'll just hold it for you, it's fine.
Thank you. My last just two questions very straight. First goes to Winnie. Thank you very much for that presentation. And the first question is the question of mobility for persons that are aged, because most of the developed state, we see persons that are aged are able to move freely. So that's something that we wish to see happen in Africa. And also to Professor Eric. You talked about the design. I already see the curriculum, competence-based curriculum is coming up with learners being prepared to just work, not to be employed, but to create employment. But I also want to question, what about the question of the increased debt in Africa? We are not able to, if we continue to work on that debt, we are not able to provide really social protection for our persons. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Is it on the audience? Are you hearing us or going to your mic? I use both of them. Speak there though. You could tell us your name, organization, and I'll put the mics for you.
Okay, so my name is Obran Jalil Odum. I belong to the African Platform for Social Protection. My question is to Professor Winnie. She mentioned that social protection in Africa is bleak, and mentioned also that she's afraid that if social protection, is non-contributory, then there will be disaster. I'm wondering, for the very poor, the reason why social protection is so important, how can that be? And that's my question.
Thank you very much. So I presume I should take the mic back to the lady so that the online audience could hear her question. Let me just, sorry, I don't think the online audience was hearing because we didn't have the mic that goes to that feed. So if we just repeat the questions you had.
Thank you. So it goes to Winnie. First is to appreciate, but the question, just two questions. First, free mobility for the aged. That is something that I would wish to happen in Africa. So how do you see that happening? And also the unpaid care workers at home. How do they benefit from the social services? And my other question goes to Eric. I want to congratulate Kenya that has introduced the competence-based curriculum, preparing learners for being engaged in the market, in the employment market. But then that is a long-term work. How is it happening with increased debt bondage and also increased unemployment within African state? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. I believe I can see a few on the chat. Are there some on the chat? Oh, okay. Oh, there's one. Sorry. I'll just hold this for you. Yes.
Thank you very much for the presenters. We have learned a lot. My question is simple. In the presentations, I did not hear anybody coming up with information of telling us how is the social protection campaign going to reach Wajiko. That one should be addressed, because it does not matter how much you talk about the social protection success unless we reach this information to Wajiko with the beneficiary of the program. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very pertinent question. How does this message and how do these interventions get trickled down to the very people that they are designed for, put out for? So I think maybe we could have Professor Mitula first respond to those that were directed her way at this point. Prof, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you. Let me just begin by the one that is asking about free mobility for the aged and the unpaid care workers. I think it's like we are going incrementally. So in this incremental work for social protection, it seems that Africa cannot afford a comprehensive of everybody who needs it. And that's why even the cabinet secretary said there are 20% and at 12%. And that does not mean that the 88% is not needy. It's only that when you look at the resources available, you can only handle this much. So for sure, in the Western world, you have a lot of this free mobility for the elderly and even in other categories. And it's because they can afford it. So really, that is all about sustainability, which has come very clearly in the cloud map that Edwin highlighted when we just responded. Issue of sustainability and affordability. On the other part, the unpaid care workers, this is all about labor market now. And it's really where the problem is because, many people are in informality. And I would see even the domestic workers and care work, unpaid care workers, and even the ones that are paid. You have care workers who are paid and the unpaid. It seems like there is nobody, many states are not able to cushion them. If you look at South Africa, that is provided for. My sister who asked the question, that is in South Africa, caregivers are paid. There is social protection for them. So it's a matter of incremental, and the states build their capital and investments, then they'll expand the support. I say the social protection is bleak, but I think I want to correct something because it's also a bit on the charts. When I'm talking about social assistance not getting us there, I mean social assistance alone. In other words, if you look at, for example, let's look at social insurance, for example. There are quite a number of people that fall off job anytime. They can fall off, like the COVID has made so many people fall off. Actually, there are people who are on social insurance who now need social assistance. So that's why I'm saying if we over-concentrate on social assistance and not look at other types of also assistance and protection, we might lose it along the way. So it's really looking at how these different models complement each other in terms of the operational ability of these modes of provision. So I'm not actually arguing that we don't need a social policy. We need, in fact, social policy is the foundation of everything. Even economic policy, you cannot achieve it if you don't have a good social policy. On the other hand, social policy is about social protection. So it's really a chicken and egg kind of thing that you cannot hold on or so. The Wanjiko thing, which is the ordinary person, the question of can social protection debate be taken down to the ordinary person? I think that is a gap, and that is why in my presentation I talked of, the formal is more of a top-down. And when you look at, when you do research and do review, you find that Wanjiko there, as it is called in Kenya, or ordinary people are very engaged and very active, like I said in my presentation. So they are very engaged on the ground there, and the state is also very engaged at the apex. So to me, really, how do you bridge these two gaps, which is part of this conference, the formality, informality, if you like, but in the chat again, you've seen the debate. Indigenous does not equate to informality. So that is another debate running in the chat that probably people will continue debating about. Many times when we say informal, we think is either poor or is African. No, these are very different concepts. The other one is very labor-based, when the other one is more of a local concept. I think I'll stop there so that Nyambega can take up to give complimentary or add. Professor Nyambega.
I'll just come in.
Thank you for your questions, and thank you, Professor Mitula, for your response. There's the issue of the CBC, competent-based curriculum. You know, I'm an 844. And when 844 was introduced, the idea was about producing people who do not rely on white-collar jobs, I think, something like that. And there used to be workshops and so many things in the schools, and it was not sustainable. In the long run, the products of 844, like me and many of us here, ended up looking like the ones for the other system, which was 763. And so let's pray that CBC will work. From where I sit, it's a very expensive system to sustain. And I'm praying that it works. It's a very good idea. And if it works, fine. And it's meant to produce people who are not job seekers. Like 844 was also meant to produce people who are not job seekers. So we hope that this time around, we get this right as a government. Now, when it comes to issues of redesigning social protection and the issue of increased debt in Africa, this is one of the issues. If you read the whole of my paper, the presentation was simply an abridged version or something of 5 to 8 slides. But if you look at the whole paper, we are talking about issues of social accountability, citizens' participation in the processes, and we're also talking about issues of addressing illicit cash flows from Africa. The problem we have in Africa is not really much about resources. Let us agree on that. It's more about how we use the resources that we have. And those resources are not trickling down to the common mwananchi. And that's where we have all these problems of many people being unemployed. So one of the issues is that if we can address the issue of illicit cash flows from Africa and we divert those monies and invest them in social protection programs, then we are going to have, we shall actually make some milestones in terms of achieving what we really need to do. So it's more about social accountability, making sure that citizens put the government on their toes and their rights. And when it comes to debt, we only borrow because we don't have money in our treasuries to do what we want to do. We get that? But if we deal with issues of corruption and illicit money, flows of money from the continent, then we are likely to borrow less. I'm not saying we shall not borrow, but we are likely to borrow less. And when we have strong social accountability mechanisms in African countries, then we are also more likely to properly invest the monies that we get from our own taxes and also from the donors to actually put in place the right programs that can sustain social accountability. And I think that is the only mechanism that I can think of that can help us in terms of dealing with the big debt crisis that African countries are having. And at the same time, the same African countries are highly ranked in terms of corruption. Now, when it comes to Ajiku, I want to compliment what Professor Winnie said. When we talk about transformative social protection programs, we are talking about a blend between what is currently formal and in the formal mechanisms. And in the informal mechanisms, we have, for instance, those social networks, the neighborhood associations, the chamas, the Muno Mukabis, all those belong to Ajiku. Ajiku actually is represented, Ajiku is a member of those grassroots neighborhood organizations. The question, which of course Professor Winnie has actually acknowledged that we have a gap in that in terms of social protection programming. And that's now where transformative social protection comes in. How are you going to design effectively design social protection programs that will take into consideration the participation and the voices of those members, ordinary members of this country, of African countries, who belong to the chamas, who belong to these neighborhood networks, who belong to these community-based associations, and get their input into the social protection program, so that the design at the end of it has got their input. I hope I've complimented what Professor Win said, and those are the only questions I had.
Sana. Yes, thank you. Just to mind. Okay. So, two questions from the audience. You're going to unmute them, huh?
Yeah, hello, thank you very much. Just want to appreciate the various presenters. They have really given us the light. My view is that we need to look into this issue of budgeting. We have good policies. We have enough budget to see to the implementation of these programs. And even when there is fiscal allocation for these programs, what of the degree or the commitment to the implementation of these programs across Africa? And this equally is related to this issue of continuity in governance. The government may have a good intention, give financial backing, and after the tenure of that government, what happens? Even with legislative backing, we may have a problem. So I want to see what we can do about proper budgeting implementation, and the role of civil society to ensure compliance to these fiscal allocation for social protection. Thank you very much, and we are happy to be part of what you are doing. Thank you.
And also that okay, and the writer. Not yet. Hello? May I proceed? Okay, Mr. Chairman, I would like to raise a question that we need to digest in the course of our deliberations concerning the Afrocentric design of any mechanisms that will be generated from this process. First of all, it goes without saying that in almost all situations in life, no one size can fit all. I agree that uniquely African social protection challenges may call for uniquely innovative social protection solutions that may not necessarily apply to other or all the regions of the world. However, it is also true that Afrocentric as a term is a politically appealing concept for many of us who may rightly subscribe to Pan-Africanism. Thus, one would suggest that we strive for the neutral terminology that neither alienates some partners nor tempts others those of us who subscribe to Pan-Africanism, to get sidetracked and getting lost in political overzealousness. Surely we can still be effective in what we are trying to achieve by devising social protection tools and mechanisms that address specific social protection situations, but rather without invoking politically emotive terminology that may turn out to be counterproductive. Instead, shouldn't we put more emphasis on the centrality of social protection in poverty reduction and development, rather than focusing on potentially divisive and probably distracting non-neutral terminology? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, I hope I'm audible, colleagues. Am I audible? Am I audible? I can see the person whose microphone. Are you hearing me, please, so that I can make my comments? Okay, okay. Now,
Good.
yes, thank you. I think when we are talking about social protection, and I need to thank the presenters, they made the excellent presentation. I think we have to bear in mind that our economy is divided into two sectors. It can work, this is my submission, it can work for those who are working in the formal sector. But I'm seeing a challenge, and this is why we would need the presenters to clarify or to put me right on the informal sector. And we know those who are working in the informal sector, they are approximately 80% of the population, and this informal sector in the areas of mining, agriculture, garages, transport, tourism, value chain, and the transport sector and other, sectors. But the point is that these are the majority, and in most cases, the amount of money which they get is not enough even to meet their day-to-day, expenditure. But the one aspect which we need to do, how can we work on their attitudinal change? I believe sometimes when you are walking in our cities, in our urban areas and suburban areas, you find a number of people, they are seated there, they are not doing anything, they are only waiting for sometimes handouts. So a situation when we are talking about social protection and we've got programs to support some of those people, we need to address that, change, so that even whatever assistance they get, then this money should be put in the right use. But then another component, and it was mentioned by the presenters, we also need to look at the other aspect of the provision of the budget. Now, do our governments have really the money that is needed to implement some of the programs for social protection? This is a dilemma which I see also coming out. But at the same time, issues of accountability. We need also to address issues of accountability, because how is the money going to be used? And something which we also need to do is, yes, we should have programs for social protection, but at the same time, we should integrate it with the training aspect, like the competence-based curriculum. And even in Uganda, as an example, they have redesigned the program to address some of the missing gaps as far as the skills are concerned. So these are elements which I thought I should bring on board, and I thank you.
And so just quickly, there were questions asked by Dr. Ezekiel Major, Simon Hongo, and Charles as well. Charles, to Shabo. And so I will ask, there's one on budgeting. There's some which kind of are sort of aligned. So I'm trying to lump them so that we can have them responded to efficiently. We have, when it comes to budgeting, there's the issue of where's the budget coming from? And do these countries, the African countries, have the money to fund all these plans and the accountability elements? I don't know which of the presenters would want to take that. There is also the concern about the use of the term Afrocentric, which is one of the, yes.
Daniel Doe would like to respond to Afrocentric.
Okay. So Dr. Daniel Doe is going to take the question on Afrocentric. Is it just a matter of semantics, or is it one that has deeper implications? So that's Dr. Daniel Doe will take that. Then when it comes to budgeting and just a matter of the monies and the accountability, I'll ask Professor Mitula to take it, and then we'll have we will finish that question with Professor Eric to come and just touch on the same. So let's take it to Dr. Doe.
All right, thank you very much and for those questions. And I really like the passion with which Simon spoke about the Afrocentric concept. I guess these are clear conceptual issues all of us have to think about. The idea about the Afrocentric issue is that, one, we acknowledge that social protection processes and social protection, the modern social protection as we know it, not the traditional one, the former social protection as we know it, has largely been influenced by Western models in terms of how it is designed, how it is delivered, all the accountability processes. So we are asking a bigger question here. Where is the African value, African concept, African ideas, African perspective in these issues? Now, of course, when we borrow some of these ways of doing social protection, we modify a few of them, but then the larger conversation of Africans present. So the use of Afrocentric is just to showcase the African perspective or an African ways of doing social protection. Now, I see that, yeah, this term can be a bit political, but at the same time, it's an issue of identity, it's an issue of ownership. So if in this platform we think that there is a better concept that can reflect the African way of doing things, I think that should be a great idea. The one is African-centered thing. Now, if it's African-centered, then Afrocentric. I saw somebody saying person-centered. At what point do we own something as African without really having the political connotation to it? So we have used this concept of Afrocentric advisedly in terms of what we bring to the debate in terms of our values, our theories, our concepts, our processes of delivery. Well, I don't know. We can keep debating the point until we are able to arrive at a more appropriate concept that fits us as a people. Yeah. Thank you.
Doctor, I'll now go to Professor Winnie Mitula to just respond to the matters of budgeting and accountability.
All right. Thank you very much. Before I get to that, could I just also mention something about this Afrocentric, just briefly? I think sometimes it's good to disrupt the norm, and this concept disrupts the norm a bit. It makes us think differently because we are coming from a perspective where we were something, and in the middle of it, we've engaged with so many values and norms, but we are getting muddled along the way. So when somebody talks of Afrocentric, it's like get back to basics, see who you are, and see what is good in what you are, and leverage it with others. I think in my presentation, I highlighted that we need to get the best of our own, but get lessons from elsewhere and nuance a unique brand. Getting into the issue of the budget, the comments from Uganda, from Charles, I think no country, not even in the West, has enough resources. For me, what I would like to see is whether Africa is advancing in terms of additional budget. Like now, we all know that most of them are below 2%. The AAU says we should have 5% of the budget allocated for social protection. What I want to see is whether Kenya, which is now at about 1.2, about 2.2 or so, gets to that maybe 4 point something where South Africa is. And when you look at countries that have better GDPs, they are basically doing better. South Africa has better GDP than Kenya. Egypt has better GDP. Cape Verde has better GDP, so doing better than Kenya. So it's growing the economy and allocating the budget accordingly. And then prioritization. Sometimes I wonder, we can debate this as we go along, whether the concept of prioritization can be brought into the debate of social protection. Because one, social protection demands that it's a must do. You know, if you need to have human resource, you must protect them when they are threatened or insecure. So sometimes prioritization does not quite work in social protection. And people always argue that we have to prioritize social protection. So it's a debate that is endless, but I think for me is more of, if we look across the 54 African states, are we seeing these budgets increasing in terms of supporting social protection? And if they are increasing, it should mean in tandem that the economy is growing and many people are also getting out of social protection. Thank you.
To ask Professor Nyambeda to just, if you've got any comment on that, it's good to go. They have sufficiently spoken. Thank you very much. And I'd like to even just thank all of you who've engaged us with your questions. I know it's not something we can exhaust in one sitting, but we shall still have the conversations going on. So at this point, I just want us to invite Helen Mudora, who's the Chief Rapporteur, in terms of a reflection on the gaps and opportunities for social protection in Africa based on evidence, to just come and share that with us now. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dan.
Just confirm long press. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you very much, Dan, for this opportunity to quickly go through our reflections. I would have wished for it to be beamed, but maybe because of the connection, just allow me to go through what we have so far. So we are looking at the reflections on gaps and opportunities for social protection in Africa based on evidence. And I have put it in a way that I am either bringing out the questions that are emerging or the issues that are emerging, and then later we'll see the opportunities. So there's a question on whether social protection is driven by the neoliberal Western thinking, or is there an opportunity to redesign social protection to respond to the context and culture of Africa? So between today and tomorrow, I think that is one thing that we should be looking at. And I think Professor Nyambega here has told us about the different phases that we've gone through in trying to, develop our social protection programs and systems. And currently what we are seeing is a hybrid of neoliberal and nationalist approaches, but we are moving more towards transformative social protection. The issue of low coverage has come up a lot, and exclusion of a huge African population in formal social protection programs. And I think in many countries in Africa, we know that over 80% of the African population is in the informal sector, meaning that 80% of the African population are excluded from formal social protection. And therefore, what is the question? The issue of the informal sector, because a lot of us are in the informal sector. So are we adequately covered by social protection, which is no. And then we find that even though our governments are focused more on social assistance, again, the number is still very low. You know, the cabinet secretary in the morning said in Kenya, only 12% of the vulnerable are covered by cash transfers. So therefore, 88% again are excluded. Yeah, and then the predominant social protection in Africa is social assistance. And I think all the speakers this morning have alluded to the fact that most of the programs in Africa have come up as social assistance programs, mainly cash transfers. And then we are seeing the low uptake of social protection by the informal sector. We find that the informal sector is reluctant to get into the contributory schemes. So our governments need to find a way of drawing in the informal sector. And a lot of the issues that have come up is the issues of costs, delivery, bureaucracy. You know, how do you pay your health insurance? How do you pay your social security if you're not in the formal sector? And then there is increased skepticism on existing social protection programs. There's this feeling that the models which we are taking, issues around, you know, we focus on targeting. You know, like if it's the cash transfers, we go and target. And sometimes if you look at the expense of targeting is usually even sometimes higher than what our governments are delivering. So then this means then there's need to redesign our social protection programs in a way that we don't spend a lot of money looking for that person who is poor and how poor are you? Do you deserve to be on the program or not? Who else deserves to be on the program? We spend a lot of time and money doing that. Is there another way we can do that and then use a lot of that resource that is going into personnel to deliver more programs? And then another thing that is running across is the issue of African states having a weak economic base, which then limits their investment in social protection. I think Professor Winnie Mitula and all the other speakers really have alluded to that. In terms of the legislative and policy framework, we see that the AAU actually formed the basis for these debates in Africa. And emerging from 2006 Livingstone Call for Africa, we have seen a lot of African governments putting social protection in their constitutions and in their laws. Actually, I think over 40 countries in Africa do have social protection embedded in the constitution. Now, the challenge is moving it from that as stated in the constitution and make it applicable and make it workable. The delivery of social protection programs, we are seeing that we have multiple actors, which then leads to inefficiency. You know, and then we also always have this silo approach. You know, one hand does not know what the other hand is doing. Therefore, we don't become very efficient in how we are using the resources in social protection. Therefore, we need to coordinate the actors, even as we, you know, talk about making social protection systems efficient. We are seeing the use of technology has come, but then we are also keen to know that although technology is good, it improves coordination, but may not solve everything. We also have to take cognizance of the fact that there is a digital gap. You know, rural versus urban in the African setup is something we need to see, even as we talk about technology. Issues of gender, you know, sometimes we have women not accessing the use of technology more than men. So therefore, all these things need to be addressed even as we talk about technology. The issue of missing voices has come up quite a lot. Dr. Do did this earlier, that most countries have adopted a top-down approach with minimal engagement of citizens and non-state actors. Therefore, in redesigning the future of social protection, these are people who need to be brought on the table, the beneficiaries, the citizens, and non-state actors. What are these opportunities then for transformative social protection? We are seeing a call to redesign of social protection programs to adopt a blend of formal and informal social protection mechanism. We are also seeing a call to depart from the current trends in social protection, which is focused on addressing economic shocks only. So then you do cash transfers, and then you leave people without health insurance or social security. So when you grow older, then again you find yourself vulnerable, like you didn't have a good pension that can take care of you when you're older. We need to embed social protection within the legal system, the constitution, the law, the policies, but also push for implementation of these laws and policies. The adoption of rights-based social protection has come up a lot. And this is also in view of the fact that a lot of our governments are providing social protection as a charity. Yeah, you know, like now in many countries, especially during COVID, there have been delays in paying. Many countries are experiencing delays. The beneficiaries have not gotten cash transfers maybe for 2 months, for 3 months, for 6 months. And this one always has an impact on their lives. You know, the blood pressure goes up, you have debts, which then you cannot pay because you're waiting for that cash transfer. So we are saying if it is a right, it must be given at the time when it is supposed to be given. You know, in Kenya, you're supposed to get a cash transfer every 2 months, yeah? Therefore, it should be consistent, but sometimes you might find there are delays, and these delays then have an issue on rights. So if it is being provided as a right, it must be on time. We must consider issues of distance to the payment point. Some people have to walk a long distance in some countries. Dignity in service provision, you know, how are these people getting the money? You can go to the bank and find a very long line, and they're out in the sun. There's no dignity in that. So if they're going to the bank, they must be treated like every other person who is going to the bank. Every customer that goes to the bank is treated with dignity. But you'll find sometimes banks have different standards for those who are getting cash transfers and their regular customers. And then expanding economies for productive employment. The call is to redesign social policy to enhance production, reform tax regimes to have more resources to sustain social protection programs. I have talked about effective coordination of social protection. I have talked about citizen engagement. And finally, the sustainability of social protection programs is key. And with COVID-19, we are having more people who are vulnerable. Then the states, our African states, must think critically. How do we sustain social protection? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Helen. We really appreciate all the feedback you've given, you've shared. Let me switch this off. Oh, it's off. Okay, good. It's off. Oh, thank you. You're not a newbie in this. No. Thank you very much for that. Once again, just say thank you to everybody who's been part of this for taking of your time and any other resource to be part of this important conversation. They do not end today. We still have the session, tomorrow's sessions, which are going to be very wholesome, I believe. And further to that, we still have the engagements that are happening online. And let's go and spread this message of just finding solutions to safeguard our vulnerable members of society, our brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, even those who may not consider relatives. Let's go and champion for them. So at this point, we'd close today's sessions, and I'd just like to invite those of us who are here in Nairobi, in this room. As you leave the room, there's a fair lady who is going to be there. She's called Elizabeth, and she's going to be handing you your meal vouchers, your lunch vouchers, and also guide to the, then you can proceed to the restaurant where we're meant to be having our lunch. Right? Is that the restaurant, Mary? It's at the restaurant, yes. Yes, which is right over there. It is to my right. When you go leaving, it's just straight ahead. You'll see it there. And then we will do this again tomorrow. Thank you once again. Thank you, Amoyo, and your guitarist. I didn't get his name. Is? D. Lee. Oh, Lee. Oh, okay. Thank you, Amoyo and Lee. You guys have been very good, and we still look forward to enjoying your music more. And for our online audience, thank you for continually engaging with us and just being part of this conversation and raising pertinent points and enabling us to get the responses to the same. Thank you very much. Like I said, my name is Dan Mwangi. We'll do this again tomorrow. Have yourselves a great afternoon. Thank you.